Hello, everybody. Talking about the principles of three-dimensional design using ceramics and sculpture as our basic theme here. So, if I click on here, then I can move forward. Um, what are these principles of three-dimensional design? There's balance, contrast, movement, emphasis, pattern and rhythm. Sometimes people use the word variety there as well. And then unity, and a word that I use a lot is gestalt. So there are other words that people use to describe these six. Sometimes there's seven, sometimes there's eight, depending on how specific people want to get about little attributes within these basic principles, but the ideas are pretty much the same. So let's take a look. Balance is the idea that you're evenly distributing the visual weight. So something gains visual weight when it has an eye attracting capability. So if it's a part of the piece that you want to look at, then we want to make sure that it isn't the only part of the piece that you want to look at. Typically, the more different things are, the more contrast there is between one element and another, the more interesting that thing becomes. But there isn't a general rule like if something's complicated, it will be visually heavier or have more visual weight than something else. It really has to do with how things relate to each other. So, like the handles have this linear aspect and they're kind of like almost like this little line drawing in space, which makes them a little bit more interesting than this basic form. The interior is a different color, so I want to look at that closely. So while this one is balanced symmetrically, where if I cut it in half, the right and the left hand side would be the same, it's also balanced in terms of this versus this color. So it has both symmetrical balance and asymmetrical balance. This piece has no contrast in terms of color, but it does have all these areas of light and shadow. And it is asymmetrical. If I were to cut it in half, either this way or this way, it would not be the same. However, what's happening over here and what's happening over here seem to balance each other out. So we would say that that is asymmetrically balanced. Contrast is differences. So we can have differences in form, we can have differences in surface, and we can have differences in color. Here we have differences in color, here we have differences in surface, and here we have differences in form. Typically, when you create contrast, you have to create balance. So see how these things build on one another. Movement is visual paths that lead the viewer's eye around a work of art. I got three examples here. This actually looks like the person is being stopped in the process of moving. But we also have these long visual lines that move from this part to this part. And then the head kind of stops us there. These long spiraling form give me a way to look from the bottom of the piece up to the middle of the piece and the middle of the piece up to the top of the piece or vice versa. The tail and the coils here, and especially when things are curvilinear, are paths that I can use to take myself to something that becomes like a focal point here. So longer lines, paths, combinations of colors and forms can all create movement in a piece of art. Oh, gotta click here again. Emphasis. Now notice I've used some of the same things here because we created contrast. This becomes a focal point. We want to look at this, but it is supported by the brick wall. Because of all the movement here, it is leading us to this head. And head, eyes tend to be focal points in and of themselves, but the artist is also giving us a way to get there, as they are here, where the center of this lip, the top of this piece, is using lines. We could call these leading lines, using contrast between the green and the red to call our attention to this opening, the focal point of that piece. There's emphasis there. Pattern and rhythm is pretty easy to understand, I would say. We got an element here, these little cut marks that are sgraffitoed into the surface of this nicely thrown form. And because we repeated that element over and over and over again, everything has something in common, and therefore everything feels unified because of a pattern or rhythm. Here, it's more forms. The forms themselves, these balls of yarn that are pierced by these what look like chopsticks or dowel rods, um, are physical things that are repeated. So we have a surface thing that's repeated, and then the actual form being repeated here to create unity, which is one of our next slides. And again, I'm reusing some of these images. Color unifies all these different forms, but the fact that a lot of them are vertical helps you unify that as well. So pattern or rhythm, it's not a pattern that we could like identify as the same thing every single time, but it's similar in the way that each box is filled. This spiral pattern isn't the same everywhere, but it is also helping to unify. And here we're balancing the contrast between these colors to create unity. And unity would be a synonym for gestalt, where everything feels like it belongs and nothing feels out of place. Color, pattern, movement, contrast all create unity in this piece. So there you have it, folks. Principles of design. I hope that helps when you are writing your final exam.